Hi, r.w.forder again. Chapman Cohen, 1st of September 1868, the 4th of February 1954. Chapman Cohen was born in Leicester, the son of Deborah and Henry, and the second of 6 children. His parents were of Orthodox Jewish background and modest means. His father was a confectioner. Chapman was generally known as CC. The Cohens moved to London in 1889. We don't really know why. Cohen wrote that he had, quote, little religion at home and none at school. But that's not to say that he considered his Jewish background irrelevant to his views. In his book, published in 1940, almost an autobiography, he explains that Christian persecution encouraged his own critical analysis of religion. CC's formal elementary education was slight, a factor he considered to his advantage. I quote, "The mental soil was healthy, with no weeds that might choke the better growth." He was, however, a prodigious reader. As a youngster, he moved from boys' tales to standard novels and then history, science, and philosophy. Again, I quote, "I can definitely date the fact that before I was 18, I was familiar with Spinoza, Locke, Hume, and Berkeley, besides having revelled in the Platonic dialogues, a love of which I have never outgrown." He remained an avid collector of books all his life. When first in London, CC was apprenticed to a cigar maker, and it seems that his association with the National Secular Society began quite by chance. In 1889, he was in London and stopped to listen to a Christian evidence speaker in Victoria Park who was debating with an elderly man with a speech impediment. The Christian speaker began to ridicule the older man. Cohen intervened, was soon being invited by the local NSS branch to speak on the society's platforms. Cohen came to writing after speaking and debating, and it seems rather reluctantly. He had been courted for several years by George William Foote, then president of the NSS, and editor of the Freethinker, and in 1897, he started writing articles for that journal. He was Foote's protege. During this period, he also briefly edited the Bradford Truth Seeker when its editor, John Grange, was ill. In 1898, he became sub-editor of the Freethinker following J.M. Wheeler's death, gradually taking on an increasingly prominent role as Foote's health declined. Apart from Freethinker articles, his first publication was a pamphlet entitled An Outline of Evolutionary Ethics. In 1915, Cohen became NSS president and Freethinker editor when Foote died. He was already 47 and had been married since the age of 24 to Celia. In 1900, Celia had given birth to a daughter, Daisy, and in 1908 she was joined by Raymond. They lived in Leytonstone in a comfortable house. They owned a bull-nosed Morris, a dog, and according to his son Raymond, who I once met, took occasional foreign holidays. They liked Westcliff-on-Sea. Celia never took paid employment. Domestic life was spoiled only by the early and tragic death of C.C.'s daughter, Daisy, as a young woman. Raymond became a very successful doctor who researched into TB, the disease that had killed Daisy. The Freethinker markedly changed its tone when the editorship passed from Foote to Cohen. The Bible-bashing, biting satire that had characterised Foote's editorship disappeared and was replaced by a more sober critique of the illogicality and contradictions of Christianity. Interestingly, Cohen, in almost an autobiography, describes a conversation he once had with Foote, in which he told Foote that he paid too high a tribute to Christianity with his hatred, and argued that you only hate that for which you maintain an element of respect. Cohen's default tone, on the other hand, was one of scholarly contempt, based in philosophy and science, particularly evolutionary theory. What he was so good at was explaining things in plain, simple English, even quite complicated ideas. Cohen always wrote the lead article for the Freethinker, and topics included criticism of Christianity and the religious and their illogicality, the irrationalism and undesirable social and political effects of religion, criticisms of the Church of England and its clergy, and commentary on social and political policies, for example, blasphemy, education, and birth control. CC was at the helm of the Freethinker and NSS through most of 2 world wars, but his attitude to each was very different. He deplored the jingoism and nationalism of the First War, but regarded the second as a necessary evil. At the end of 1914, Cohen wrote in the Freethinker, I quote, "The beating of Germany in the field will not secure peace, but the getting of different ideas into German heads and into the heads of other people will. Guns may kill men, but they are powerless against ideas." In 1935, he wrote, "The Freethinker is one of the few papers in this country that can look back upon its wartime records without regret or shame." The 2 world wars, with their associated paper shortages, put great pressure on the Freethinker, but it never missed an issue, despite the offices being destroyed during a raid in the Second World War. During the 1920s and 1930s, the NSS and Freethinker offices and the headquarters of the Pioneer Press were at 61 Farringdon Street. Cohen generally did most of his work at home, visiting the offices perhaps twice a week. There was a full-time secretary. The Freethinker was a weekly national publication which comprised 16 pages for most of the interwar years. Cohen also authored around 25 hardbound books and numerous pamphlets and leaflets. CC was enthusiastic about the establishment of the League of Nations in 1919, although he would have preferred the title the League of People. He gave support to the Reform Acts, which extended the vote to women. He argued in favour of women being given the ability to control their fertility. He was an opponent of the blasphemy laws and a staunch defender of free speech. He also deplored the privileged access of the religious to the BBC, favoured a liberalisation of the divorce laws, advocated sex education, and favoured a freer and more scientific attitude to sexuality, the repression of which he explored in detail in his book Religion and Sex. Religion in schools was a constant preoccupation. In that sense, some things never change. Cohen travelled the country giving lectures. During the 1919 indoor lecturing season, for example, that means from autumn all the way through to spring, he spoke on at no less than 34 venues on more than 50 occasions. The venues included Manchester and Leicester, often, Abertillery, South Shields, Swansea, Glasgow, Paisley, Edinburgh, Liverpool, Belfast, Leeds, etc., etc. Subjects included a range such as Christianity, the Army and the Nation, free thought, religion and death, God and evolution. In 1919, he also debated with the Glasgow spiritualists. There are many stories about Cohen's ability as a speaker and his sharp wit and humour. Raymond told me of one. At one meeting, the issue of deathbed recantations came up. At the time, it was believed that Napoleon had been a heretic who recanted on his deathbed and begged for God's mercy. During the meeting, a Christian heckler shouted out, "What did Napoleon say on his deathbed?" Cohen looked puzzled, scratched his head, and replied, "Not tonight, Josephine." Everything Cohen wrote and said was rooted in his freethought atheism and trenchant criticism of religion. However, by the end of the Second World War, Cohen was an old man. His writings had become repetitive, he was forgetting things and becoming confused. At both the 1947 and 48 National Secular Society annual conferences, there was resistance to his re-election. The minutes of the 47 conference have Colin McCall saying that Cohen was no longer able to carry out his duties. He said the NSS was living in Victorian times and that Cohen should follow Bradlaugh's example and resign when he was no longer able to carry on an active role. Shortly before the 49 conference, Cohen made it clear that he would not seek re-election. Following a particularly disastrous meeting, he was succeeded by W.H. Rossetti. For a while, Cohen carried on with Freethinker, although he became increasingly dependent on others, particularly Herbert Kuttner. On May the 27th, 1951, he resigned the editorship. He died from pneumonia less than 3 years later. Remarkably, CC's voice has not entirely disappeared because in 1932, Edison Bell made a recording, The Meaning and Value of Free Thought. So we can hear from the man himself by searching for his name on YouTube. So what were his achievements? Well, first and foremost, there was the brilliance of his writing. Nobody has ever written so clearly and coherently when making the case for unbelief. In my opinion, his pamphlets for the people make out the positive case for non-belief better than anybody else ever has. Second, as a speaker, he had few peers. Though he lacked the physical presence of a Bradlaugh, his logic, calm and quick wits disarmed and shamed hecklers who were frequent in those days. Sidney Gimson wrote of Cohen, quote, He has a wonderful power of clear thinking with the gift of putting his arguments in simple and convincing language. So formidable was Cohen as an advocate that he generated a loyal following that held him in awe. Very recently, the former NSS president, Barbara Smoker, sadly now deceased, told me that when she became president of the society in 1972, Cohen's memory was still revered. When Cohen took over from Foote, he also brought stability and calm to the NSS. This had not always been the case before. Agonised public appeals and cries for help ended. Cohen was greatly helped in this respect by a court judgment known as the Bowman Judgment, which reached the House of Lords on appeal in 1917. Prior to this, the legality of bequests could and were successfully challenged. Much of this was Foote's work, but Cohen had assisted him, and it was the Freethinker under Cohen that was the main beneficiary. Finally, I am influenced by one of Sidney Gimson's comments when he wrote of some of the other speakers that appeared at the Leicester Secular Hall. I quote, "They adopt the conventional religious attitude and do not recognise how loose thinking reacts on their judgment on social problems." Nobody could accuse Cohen of loose thinking. Well, there were some downsides. First, Cohen was autocratic in his conduct of the council and the conference of the NSS. He so dominated the NSS and the Freethinker that to a large extent they were him. That brings great dangers, particularly when the time for succession arrives. In his book, Almost an Autobiography, Cohen commented that he'd spent a lifetime doing what interested him. As such, his interests were those of the NSS, and the NSS became divorced from political campaigns. Cohen held politicians in low regards, did not generally associate with them, and thought ideas far more important than the grubby game of politics. As Cohen himself wrote, quote, "Those who lack the good sense and intentions to enter worthwhile occupations often turn to politics." The trouble was the NSS became inward looking. Cohen wrote and spoke to his admirers applauded, but the society had little influence outside its own ranks. Finally, Cohen simply stayed too long. After the Second World War, his powers were in decline, but he was a stubborn old man who refused to go. Fortunately, by then, the NSS was suffering a decline in membership and many individuals of talent had gone. It never really recovered until 1963 with the election of David Tribe as president, when the NSS once again became an outward-looking organisation which campaigned for the many liberal reforms of the Wilson government's Roy Jenkins Home Secretaryship. CC was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium. There are no memorials to Chapman Cohen, and there's no biography, although Jim Herrick gives an interesting account of his Freethinker days and some additional biographical information. Thank you for listening. If you want to contact me about this or any other aspect of secularist and NSS history, my email address is r.w.forder@btinternet.com.